Good morning. Thank you all for coming. Let's call the Budget Committee meeting to order, noting that Mark Hetzel and I are here. Jack is not able to attend. I need approval of the agenda.
So move.
Great, thank you. I received no public comments. Anybody else? So starting with a budget update. Steve Raleigh, take it away.
Thank you. So there's two topics that we were hoping to discuss under the end of the year balance. The first topic of the two was our end of the year annual Fund 73 contribution. So Fund 73 is our post-employment benefit trust fund. We had been talking this spring about the possibility of not making a payment into Fund 73 as a method to help us with budget planning for 22-23. That discussion took place prior to us learning about the ESSER 3 funding allocation for our district. And the second thing that took place before learning about ESSER 3 was the recommendation of this committee that was brought to the full board regarding end of the year building and department funds. So there were two things, I would call them of more significance that we were discussing pre-ESSER 3 funds. So we were hoping to revisit both of them. But I think we have to revisit them in the context of the discussion as well that we're going to have at next Monday night's board meeting about a reimbursement resolution, because it's all really connected together. The reason why this topic is connected to a potential reimbursement resolution is regarding cash flow. So when we do our annual calculations for cash flow, we get to the point by the middle of October that we basically do not have the funds to make the October 30th payroll and can sometimes not make our accounts payable payments. And that's really related to our cash flow borrowing process is very tightly aligned between our annual meeting, which is the third Monday in October, which is a necessary step to do the borrowing, and that end of the month, basically payroll. We certainly did not factor in a year ago the possibility of an $800,000 payment to the architect outside of a referendum process. It can be done, but for cash flow reasons, we would probably need to maintain course with what we discussed pre-ESSER so that we would have the cash available to pay those bills. And so what I mean by that is like the employee benefit trust fund, we could pay 100,000, we could pay $500,000 into it. But once that payment goes in, we can't pull it back out like if we needed it for cash flow reasons. We can put it in later. So if the board decided to make a double payment next year, that's no problem. We can easily do that. But we can't reverse the payment in. It's basically a one-way trip with the funds and then they're there. Jack did express an interest in making some type of a payment when we had that discussion before, but as well, that was pre-discussion on reimbursement resolution. So we were looking to just get some initial feedback as to whether or not this committee feels like we should reverse course with our plan to try to save $1 million by the end of this fiscal year, or whether we should just continue on that path. Instead of continuing on that path really for budget planning, we'd be continuing on that path for reimbursement resolution planning. So the purpose would switch from one thing to another. But we really want to get your feedback on this to know what your perspective is regarding that discussion that we had, pre-ESSER 3 funds.
In Fund 73, I think I saw in the budget there is there's 7 million. I mean, it's a huge
It
number.
is, yeah.
I'm really fine skipping the payment, and trying to figure out the reimbursement and short-term funding, all of those things before we.
Yeah, if you're proposing it, I'm trusting that you have a terrific understanding of the impact on Fund 73 and future payments and what we may need to do liability wise. So if you think if you're comfortable with it, I'm comfortable with it. How much do we have? How much of the payment do we make? I forget what that is.
Somewhere around like $500,000.
That's what I thought.
Yeah,
And
in
then
that range.
any guesstimate now at the end of the year, carryover funds, or is that still in limbo? Or
I would say if we continue with the course that we had planned, it was on course to be over $1 million added to the end of the year fund balance with not paying this with,
okay, combination.
Yeah, combination.
Between the two of them, there's a
and
million.
right, and some of the other things that we've talked about, that's where we are in course for, which if we're able to achieve that, it would nicely line up with the reimbursement resolution and needing to make that payment. Obviously, the one thing from the board members' perspectives, you only saw that idea for the first time at that May special board meeting. No one really weighed in on whether or not you supported that idea
Right.
or whether or not you had a goal of Heritage opening by September 2024. It was a presentation that really talked about possible timelines.
Right.
So we haven't really had that discussion, but in the event that the board decided that was a path that was going to be pursued, we really would need to continue the course of trying to save those funds throughout the remainder of this fiscal year, really for cash flow reasons, so that we could make it through that process.
Right.
And like I said, there's no reason why this committee can't revisit this topic at a later point and then decide potentially to make a double payment next year.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing to just share the fiscal impact of not making the payment. We do receive state categorical special ed aid on the Fund 27 portion. So as an example, if we paid $500,000, typically 15% of that expenditure is special ed. So you're down to 75,000. Of that 75,000, about 30% would be reimbursed. So you're down to about 21,000. So out of like a $500,000 decision, we would potentially be risking $21,000 in reimbursement not coming back. So it certainly isn't a number that would drive our decision. It's just something to be aware of. So I guess at this point, unless the board members have any further comments, we will just continue the course that we're on to try to save those funds by the end of the year.
You want committee's support of that by vote?
I don't think that's necessary.
Okay, good.
Next budget changes for the 21-22.
So I think I'll have Ally just talk for a minute about what this process is and the work that we've done on updating the budgets and what that document is that's attached. Ally, if you would mind just reviewing this process.
Sure. So Steve and I sat down and we went through all of the line items in the budget and balanced everything. There wasn't a ton of changes that we had to do. We just had to update common school funds. We had to update the legal budget because we were quite a bit over this year. Utilities came in higher than expected. We did save some transportation funds in special ed because we purchased 2 vans and we were doing the transportation ourselves. The contingency budget only had one minor expense come out of it, so we were able to move those funds to balance out some of the other line items that were over. We had to change the portable classroom over at the middle school. It was just in the wrong account, so we had to move that.
Do you clarify what was it?
It was the portable classroom over at the middle school. It was, we received information from our auditors on how to correctly book it, so we just had to move it to where it was supposed to be.
Okay.
The music instrument budget, that was the 80,000 that the board approved, correct? And then we did receive a check from unemployment, and that was an unexpected revenue that we did not know we were going to get. We had an increase in miscellaneous revenues, and that was a property insurance refund and then prior year taxes. There was an increase in state education categorical aid, and then we did the Fund 39 transaction for paying off our debt.
Thank you, Ashley.
So this is a formal process that we're required to go through once a year. Some districts do it continuously throughout the year. We prefer to wait till the end of the year, just do it once and present it to you. And so we would be looking for a recommendation to take this to the board meeting, or we'd be happy to answer any questions.
So
You
say
might have-
they ended up in a minus 193,000, or because of additional expenses?
Yeah,
Is that
so,
about right?
yeah, so what Mark's referencing is the combined total of all of these in Fund 10 resulted in a minus, and there's 2 main reasons for that. The first one is the music instrument budget was approved by the school board at the conclusion in May of 2021 to come out of end of the year balances for 2020, 2021. So we needed to complete that entire process first and then create a budget. And the same thing with the costs of the portable classroom. So Ally identified that we had to properly code it,
Okay.
which we did do through this process. But then secondarily, the board also approved that project to come out of the end of the year funds of the year prior. And so the way that we have to do that, because we can't just code something to our end of the year fund balance, we have to actually code it to an expense first, which then does impact the end of the year balance. So those 2 asterisks were the reason why it's a negative, but I would actually state that it's more of an accounting thing to have it be a negative because that's what was planned all along. Sure.
Thank you.
So you need a motion to move this on to the full board.
So move.
Second, so that is complete. Moving on to our fund balance classifications.
So this one is more of a formality. And basically the national accounting standards expect that a board or governmental board will approve the fund balances prior to the close of the fiscal year to indicate to the auditors when they come in the summer what accounts as a school board that you have approved to use. The intent behind that is not for us to get to the summer and then just create something brand new and have Ally and I put 200,000 into an account code and then bring it back to you in September and you would say, what is that? You know, why did you do that? So it's more of a procedural piece. An example of something that we did do where the board weighed in on it last year, the board weighed in on a desire to set aside funds for the Warrior pitch for the turf replacement. So this committee made the recommendation to add that in to the process. So there are some times when there might be a little something different in this. And so we did have that last year, but this year, Ally and I are not aware of anything that would cause us to request a change in what we've done. So there, to our knowledge, we don't recall a discussion that's taken place this year that on any topic or any project where the board said we'd like to start setting money aside or doing something like that. So basically, we're just recommending continuing with the past practice, which would mean designating those funds for Warrior Stadium itself. We've been doing that for a number of years, continuing with the pitch, turf replacement, and the other accounts you see on that report. So we don't have any changes.
So will the Fund 41 close after this year? Or will there still be a little carryover to the next?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as a result of our Moody's credit rating last spring, this committee recommended moving the tax levy for Fund 41 back into Fund 10 and then to draw down Fund 41. So it will likely take one more year, Mark, for us to complete that process. We were thinking it would probably take 3 years. We will continue with the board's decision to have the tax levy be in Fund 10 and just pull down the balance from the projects approved by the facility committee, which will likely take another year unless the facility committee does end up recommending something different in the next year, which may speed it up.
Okay. Thank you.
So do you need anything from us on the fund balance?
We're looking for a motion to recommend approval, please, at the next regular board meeting.
So move.
Thank you. I'll second that. Moving on to budget planning.
So the timeline indicates that the second draft is presented at the regular June board meeting. Some of the next major milestones would be the state provides an estimate of equalization aid on July 1st. And then typically we do ask this committee to meet. I know the timeline's really tight because it's the 4th of July week before the regular board meeting. In some years, this committee has preferred to meet on the day of that regular board meeting and avoid meeting during the week before. So we can talk about that next week, but we do typically ask this committee to meet, look at a third draft of the budget, including looking at that statement from the state that comes out on July 1st. And so that's really the next steps in this process. Any questions on the timeline?
Could we get the copy of that before we, we even decide to meet?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I know it'll be in the agenda, but the advance read might help us a little bit in terms of deciding, okay, when exactly do we want it?
Sure, absolutely. Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah, and if folks have plans that week, there's certainly no reason why we can't meet on that Monday.
Sure.
I mean, it could be in the morning like this.
Yep.
We're open to it. It's whatever works
Sure.
for everyone on that week. I know there's people definitely, getting away that week and spending time, but we're happy to accommodate. I'm gonna ask Ally to talk about the changes to the second draft of the budget. She's the one who worked on these over the last month, so if you want to just cover what was updated.
Sure. So the biggest changes were the update to Fund 50 after the board approved the 5-cent increase of meals. Another major change was the school board approved student fees, so this affected the school's revenue and expense budgets. We updated Fund 21 after those budgets were submitted by each school. And then number 3 goes back to the approval of student fees, and then that changed the building and department revenues and expense accounts. And then we also updated the common school funds again. We're still using the January number because we won't have next year's number until next year. And then those are the main changes for this second draft, and then the third draft in July will have quite a few changes that we will present at that time.
If I could just add to what Ally mentioned by saying what we didn't do in the second draft is, Rebecca, if you could pull that down a little bit to get to the notes for the third draft. Okay, so number 5, discussion on ESSER 3 additional allocation. So we did not make any changes in the second draft of the budget to the additional funds that we learned about for ESSER 3. Couple of reasons for that. The first one is we had the opportunity to go to each building and have meetings with the staff on the topics of referendum planning and budget planning, and wanted to also talk about what we learned about ESSER 3. So we wanted to get a chance to make sure that everyone was aware of that. Secondly, we want to make sure our student services and curriculum team have time to process what that might mean for our organization. The bottom line is we didn't want to rush anything. We didn't want to just push something in front of you after only a couple of weeks of really learning about the significant news. We do have until the fall of 2024 to claim the funds. But what I do think is important for board members to be thinking about, at least around this topic, is the second draft of the budget had, and the first draft, had a deficit on purpose as we were planning towards a referendum, an operational referendum question in November. The third draft of the budget is the draft that is taken to the public at the annual meeting, and it's published in the paper. So what I think the board members want to think about is, do you want to present a budget to the community that shows a planned deficit which isn't accurate anymore because we have the ESSER 3 funds coming in and we can use a portion of them for sure? Or would you like to see us come back for the third draft of the budget and balance it out at a minimum, including some of the ESSER 3 funds that we learned about, so we'd be presenting a budget to the community that's balanced prior to the referendum discussion? So it's just something to think about. On one hand, we don't want to rush to make decisions on ESSER 3, but on the other, we don't want to present a picture that makes the budget situation look worse than it really is because we haven't inserted the ESSER 3 or a portion of the ESSER 3 funds in. So I would just say it's something to think about. As far as how you as a board would want to present our third draft of the budget to the community, how that impacts the November referendum process, and what you would like to have us consider doing as we move forward, because we're in a position where fundamentally what we'd be able to do with ESSER 3 is meet the federal requirements for ESSER 3. There's very specific requirements that come with the funds. But we also have invested significantly in a variety of those areas that would qualify for federal funding. Meaning the board invested in reading and math positions in May of 2021 with the idea that federal funding could support those positions. The board has invested in COVID-related expenditures, again, upfront, and now we have the possibility of moving them into ESSER 3. An example of one of those expenses that would be eligible is our annual HVAC process that results in us having the highest quality indoor air systems available to our students. We were going to do that no matter what, but now the federal government would support that effort. So those are examples of how the budget itself could be balanced by properly utilizing these federal resources towards the right expenditures. And I think just something to think about as a board is, what would you like that third draft to look like? Do you want it to balance? Do you want us to put more ESSER 3 funds in as a revenue than we're putting in as expenses to show a positive balance? Do you want us to present it as it currently exists without the ESSER 3 funds and continue that discussion through the summer and fall? There's really not a right or wrong answer to it. It's just, what do you think would be the right approach to presenting that budget to the community? The other thing I could throw out there as another alternative, in some years, the budget committee has asked for another month before actually taking that budget to the community. And in some years, we've done a fourth draft in August, which has allowed us to kind of continue the dialogue and the planning. There's absolutely no reason we can't do that if that would be a preference. So if the board reflects on this and says, we would like some more time, let's think about this, we could certainly do that. Ally and I can add a fourth draft in that can be focused on ESSER, and we could certainly have some options. So at this point, I would just ask you to start thinking about it.
Is there any reason not to do the balance instead of waiting till doing a fourth draft and then having it come in balanced? If we want to present a balanced budget to the community. I mean, right now I sense the direction you take isn't going to change much in a month. Am I correct on that? Or would more time be helpful? Fair enough, how you want to allocate it?
I personally think more time would be helpful. I don't know, Randy, do you want to weigh in on that?
No, I think that makes sense.
I would rather not rush the decision.
No, I agree.
Because going in with a transparent, if we have a deficit, I mean, we got zero from the state and we are asking for monies for salaries. I just think we need to have a good plan. I mean, I think they will support whatever we're going to propose, but we got to have a solid plan.
And I'm not opposed to a fourth budget and then make the decision. Again, unless your council is, you need more time to figure it out.
Does anyone have any questions on the second draft for Ally? She put yellow highlights on everything that she changed.
Nice
I know
job.
she can
Great
answer
job.
any
Very
questions.
easy to read. Thank you.
Otherwise, we would be looking for a motion to bring that forward next Monday night.
So move.
Second. So that will move forward to the board. Thank you, Ally. Moving on to the more budget planning for a referendum.
All right, so I do want to spend a little more time if we can on this topic. And would like to make sure that we understand your thought process on what would be helpful as board members if this dialogue takes place over the next couple of months. Let me start by explaining what we did in an effort really to prompt the discussion. And we'll see if this was helpful to you or if we should try to do something else. So what we did is we took a spreadsheet that this committee has seen that we were using for budget planning for 22-23. And we made it much larger and really included the 7 kind of key components over a 5-year period of time. So all staffing requests received through the 3-year budget planning process. So if you recall, this committee requested the administrative team identify staffing requests over a 3-year period of time. So we put all of those in. All non-staffing requests received through the 3-year budget planning process were put in. The initial budget planning process for 22-23 formed the base. So that was the base of what was in here. Where this really starts getting complicated is like numbers 4 and 6. Estimated state budget revenue increases for the next 2 state budgets. Number 6, estimated salary increases to reflect both CPI and compensation system increases for the following 4 years. Number 5, insert the ESSER 3 funding, which we did over a 2-year period of time. And then added lines that we're calling right now to be determined on operational costs for the new Heritage and the new middle school. The intent behind this format is to try to make sure that all of the major components that might go into an operational referendum question are in there, so that as we work on it over the next couple of months, the board would have an opportunity to weigh in on some of what I would call are those big topics in that spreadsheet. I also want to comment on how this process is directly connected to the capital question and what dollar amount that might be. And it's also connected to the topic of a consistent tax rate across time. So the community survey that we distributed, there was a strong positive response for the community towards a capital and operational referendum question if we could put something together that maintained that consistent tax rate across time. Where we're going with that is Ally and I spent about an hour yesterday with our financial advisors working through a number of scenarios. We came to the conclusion that the most accurate information that we could share with the school board would come after the state provides the state aid estimate on July 1st. Our initial thinking was that Eric Cass would come to the special board meeting in June. Our new thinking after our discussion is that the July board meeting, the first one, would be a better place for Eric to come after we have the state aid result to walk through the process. So that would mean the special meeting in June would focus on Vogel coming in and sharing the detailed budgets with the board. So again, that's the first time the board will have seen those detailed budgets on those schools and a refreshed budget on the high school. And again, the discussion from our architects on some of the questions that board members had regarding like a full-size track and orientating the middle school and the timelines. So our intent is to focus on Vogel and Epstein at that second meeting in June. Be able to take those budgets that are presented to the board, share them with the financial advisor, and come to the July board meeting to talk about what might be possible. It's hard to have a conversation on either the capital question or the operational question until as board members you can see what would be possible for us to do and to maintain that consistent tax rate. So we don't want to push anyone into having to weigh in on something or make a decision on something until it's the right time. Which leads me back to this. I don't want to put the board members in a position right now where you have to weigh in on, yes, you would support the new pathways position in year 2, or yes, you would support the hockey ice time request. Because right now, that would be putting that discussion before we really know what is possible. And I think it would make more sense for us to learn what is possible, and then for the administrative team to present something back to you that matches that goal of a consistent tax rate. Otherwise, I feel like we'd be sitting here going through this super long list, and it would take a very long time, and I don't think it would be super productive. But I think it would be better if we did that. And so the timing of this would look like Eric Cass coming to the regular July board meeting. And then we have that special board meeting in July where we would then be able to present what I would view as draft resolution questions for both the capital and the operational question that match what the financial plan could support. And then we'd have that ability to make that discussion, have that discussion. So what we put in front of you today was a framework to allow us to have that discussion.
Sure.
There's a $6 million option and a $10 million option. And of course, there's plenty of options in between. Right? So the 6 million is what you've seen before. So if you go back to January of this year, PMA presented a $150 million capital question and a $6 million operational question, which kept the tax rate consistent. Then in March, they came back and presented a debt service repayment plan, updated that 150 million and $6 million plan at the same time. So in July, we would be able to answer the question or get really close to what kind of repayment would we be able to put in place this fall. And then what would be possible on both the capital and the operational question. We then think we could create something between 6 and 10 for discussion's sake that would work. So as an example, if PMA comes back and says, with the cost of the middle school and the cost of Heritage and the high school projects, that's X. We can then do X for an operational referendum to equate to the same tax rate. We could come back and show that to you and say, okay, that is, let's say hypothetically 175 for the capital question, but we have to stay at 6 for the operational question to make it work, right? So that's one possibility. Or it could be something like 170 and 7. But the fundamental approach that we're taking is to balance the two to remain committed to that goal that was identified in the community in that survey. But in between now and then, if this format is not helpful to you, we can create a new one. Or if this format is hard to understand or doesn't work for you, we would like to make sure we're presenting information to you that is helpful in going through this decision-making process. This was our first attempt at it, and we kind of just put everything in one spot, but we know it's a lot. But we're just looking for some initial feedback on both the timing that I just mentioned, as well as this format, or anything else that you think might be helpful as we go down this path over the next couple of months. And Randy, do you want to add anything about the timing or?
No, I think you explained it well, Steve, and I think just kind of iterating that there's a lot of options here. And we're just trying to kind of throw out the kind of the slate of what we can do, and also just kind of have some realities of kind of how we need to move forward. So I think it's really an open discussion that we're looking for feedback.
Steve, when you look at affordability and what we can afford, are you also including anticipated average increase in tax base because of projected new homes? Or is that an isolated thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's gonna be a huge component of what we ultimately build into a financial plan. Because as an example, if you go back to last fall, Eric Cass came out to the board and presented a very early look at what a financial plan could look like. And former board member Dave Betcher said, your estimates for new homes in our community is way too low. And I would like you to take a look at that, look at the last 10 years and come back with something that's more reflective of what is happening here. So PMA factored that in to their second version of their plan, which came back in front of the board in January. So ultimately, as board members, one of the things that Eric has to present when he comes in July is the variables that are being used to develop the plan. One of them is community growth. So when Dave asked us for that data, we found out that the average over the last decade was a little over like 5.5%. And PMA was using 3%. And then they were using 0 after 10 years. And so what Allie and I were talking to them yesterday about is in the Waunakee community in 2020, there was, 2021, which is going to hit the next tax rolls for this fall. There was significant new housing starts. It was higher than it had been in recent years. So 3% is likely low. 3% is below our long-term average. So that's going to be a factor where we have to decide, do we use 3% for the next 10 years, even though we know it's been 5 for the previous 10? Do we split the difference and go 4? Know that 5 has been the actual number. 4 would be going underneath it. So those are the kind of things, Mark, that when Eric presents ideas to the board in July, board members are going to have the opportunity to weigh in and say, I think that's too low for our community, or I don't think that's conservative enough. Another area just like that is interest rates, right? We're talking about borrowing over the next 4 years. The interest rates that were in the discussion that we were having yesterday are higher than what some districts have recently been able to borrow at. So it's a matter of like, if you go too conservative with the financial plan itself, you're potentially impacting the questions, the referendum questions, in a way you don't need to. If you use too aggressive of numbers, like let's just say growth numbers of 6%, unfortunately, it's going to be very difficult to come back to the community and let everyone know we did hit that consistent tax rate, right? Because if any one year it didn't meet that, we would have a hard time doing the 1089. So it's a balance between the two. I think you'll find that maybe it's a little too far on the conservative end, but as board members, you'd have to be comfortable with, what is in there and what makes sense, because community members are going to be asking without question, how can we accomplish a referendum question of X size with a consistent tax rate?
Right.
That's going to be the biggest question coming out of this. That'll probably be a bigger question than the project itself, right? Because we saw the response from the community on the project itself. It was pretty high response rates to the project that we discussed in May. The question I think is going to be more likely from community members is, how do you do that without impacting the tax rate? So yes, Mark, that's a critical part of it.
I really appreciate the form you used and putting all of the requests there. I also appreciate you guys vetting it out ahead of time, because we don't have that expertise. When I look at the list, there are a few things that come to my mind. When we are in the buildings talking to staff, there's a huge frustration about substitutes. Should that be in here? Should we have more subs in building? I'm just throwing it out, because when I look at what really interferes in our staff doing the best job possible, they're pulled out to sub way too many times. I also hear a lot of hope and desire by some of our K and first grade teachers to have more para support. And I know that didn't get in here, and I don't know how the building principals laid out their long-term plan, if they even thought that was a possibility. So, I mean, I think you guys need to vet it out, but I also would just like to throw those ideas out of what we have heard year after year of frustration and what might help improve our kids' opportunity to advance and learn.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up, because I was actually planning to get a meeting with you with regard to the ESSER to those two specific issues. And I don't know how long ago it was, but the impression is that each K and one teacher had a para, and they've gotten away from that. And so they borrow from other areas. And it's just not the same. And I think that has led to frustration and stress. And the substitute teaching the same thing. If I don't know if it's possible to hire an additional full-time sub per building, or maybe 3 additional full-time subs that float something to that, to try to relieve that pressure, but I was hoping we could use some of the extra funds for those 2 issues.
I think there's 2 things we can look at. One of them, when you look at like the primary level, I think what we had was we had 1 paraeducator per every 2 classrooms.
Yes.
That was kind of the model. So we can kind of see where we fall within that realm. I still think we support that, but we can double check that. Piece of the subs is an ongoing conversation. I mean, Brian and I had a detailed conversation a few weeks ago as we were short. I mean, we had 60 people gone. We had 40 some subs in the district. So it wasn't necessarily that we're like totally depleted on subs. It's also an issue of kind of at different times of the year when we have people gone. And so it's kind of it's a both piece. So that was a conversation I know we've had, is that we're going to keep our permanent subs in each building. And then it's a question, well, should you add more? Well, they come at a higher cost, but adding 1 or 2 in a building doesn't impact 40. So that's kind of the revolving question as far as number of subs, and also then just availability of staff to take time off, and then how that impacts us as well. So it's a piece that we'll definitely take a look at and can report back to you on, but that's kind of the dynamic with that. But we can certainly look at kind of where we are with our ratio on the appreciate that.
And you can certainly take time to reflect on this if there's things that cross your mind. I mean, we're putting this out there earlier than we need to just prompt discussion. I think the other thing that all of the board members will need to weigh in on at some point is really that number 6. So the community survey response was overwhelmingly high to the question of a positive response, high positive response, to including salary increases in an operational referendum to keep to attract and retain a high quality staff. What I was sharing with staff at the meetings that we held was a viewpoint that could be considered as to what that means, but it's maybe not the only viewpoint. What I shared as to what that could mean is fully funding CPI and compensation system increases each year, meaning the new system, the newer system that was approved is fully funded, and whatever the calculation is that comes out of the WERC for CPI is fully funded. That's one interpretation. Brian has also done some work about, let's say as an example, the members of our teaching staff who are below average in pay, because of prior hiring practices. One could look at that and say that should be fixed. It should, right? So like that's another thing that number 6. I also know Brian's aware of some other positions not in the teaching category as well, that we would need to reflect on their average and where are they at. So like a catch-up pay, I'll call it, for other employee groups, right? Sure. So someone could view that as, well, that should mean this, right? And so I definitely think at some point we need to all have a discussion on what does that mean to everyone. And what Allie and I put in there was at a high level, our best effort to assume inflation goes up next July 1st. The following July 1st, I put it back to what we just had and then tapered it down, because the assumption is that the Federal Reserve's interest rate adjustments will eventually impact inflation and potentially put the economy into a recession. But that's the reason why they're intending to raise rates the way they are, right? So if you look in there, you see I took like where we were this year, I went up for next year, came back to where we were this year, and then tapered it down a bit with the assumption that the Federal Reserve stated goal of pulling back down inflation is going to work. So that's in there, right? So you'd have to look at that and say that you're comfortable with that or you're not. And then ultimately in the end, depending on what our financial ability is, we are likely going to have to determine priorities within this larger spreadsheet, right? It's possible the larger number, which would kind of do everything, isn't possible. And so between that and the 6 million, whatever might be possible. So like as an example, because we know number 6 had such strong support from the community, as a board, you might say that's a priority in here, right? Before you go into the non-staffing requests or before you go into the whatever, like that has to be done, right? So that's an example of prioritization of what may need to happen in there. We may need to push things from one year to the next or 1 year to the next. If we think next year we're going to be faced with the CPI in the 6s, we may have to take what was on that initial plan for next year and move some things. That would be an example. But we will need direction, at least on some of these bigger items, as far as what are the priorities of the board, so we can move things around accordingly. But that's a discussion that's going to need to happen, because ultimately, if a community member approaches a board member and asks to explain, you know, what are the big pieces in the operational referendum question, we all need to have a common understanding of what's in there on that salary side that reflects the community's response.
But I feel figuring out what's affordable and having the administration do the first vetting is really primary to us getting involved.
The one thing I don't know if it's embedded somewhere, Randy, but earlier in our discussion about the operational portion, we'd also talked about program development. So is that embedded in staffing anticipations, or I just don't see anything that addresses, you know, program growth or perhaps new programming that we wanted to do that just isn't within our wheelhouse.
So
So
anything specific you had in mind that you were looking for? I mean, this definitely has a growth perspective in it to kind of look at how we accommodate growth going forward, but is there anything specific that you were thinking of that I'm kind of blanking out on, kind of if there was a program that we talked about specifically around?
but nothing, well, perhaps mental health programming. I don't know if there's, or where we want to be, if we, you know, if that was something that we're looking to maybe enhance somehow, in terms of perhaps looking at the curriculum budgeting and the impact of technology on that.
Sure.
Sometimes the technology is more costly than the textbooks, and so was that something that needs to be included, needs to be at least considered? I know earlier, just there's this vague sense of, well, perhaps programming, it was part of the concept, and I'm not sure.
I think it is, Mark. I think it's filtered in there in a couple ways. First of all, through like the staffing requests, and then also through some of the non-staffing requests,
Right.
also support program pieces. I think the other piece that we're talking about is you look at like mental health, definitely a priority piece, but it was really addressed, I think, through some of the requests as far as what might we need to kind of bolster some of our staffing pieces. Steve Alley, you and I kind of touch base to see kind of where those pieces are with like the curriculum PD type aspects. But I think when we use the term kind of program development or program growth, it was partially kind of built off of really those two request processes and how those would be seen as supporting the growth of our school district. I mean, we're also seeking out different things for grant funds, et cetera. I mean, I can see things in like robotics and other areas. Those are pieces that I don't necessarily have filtered into here particularly, but basically are things that we're looking at as far as seed money from grants to kind of move forward. But definitely, as you start to look at the dollars here, it does support some of those things. So I think those first two processes we went through, those 3-year planning pieces, incorporate some of that. And then I think what we're going to have is you'll continue to see how that gets applied.
Any further comments on this?
Last item are lease agreements for the coming school year. Yes.
Sure, so there were 3 leases that were being renewed for this year. The first one is the Wisconsin Youth Company, and that's the K-4 after-school program. The Dane County office at the Heritage Elementary, and then the new teacher project that's also at Heritage Elementary. There was a slight increase on the Wisconsin Youth Company one, and that went from 2,700 to 2,800. The Dane County lease was the same for $75 per month, and then the new teacher project was also the same at $300.
Remind me, do we run the after-school program at just one center, at just Prairie, or it's at all 3? So you would need a motion for these.
I move we approve all the contracts presented.
I would second that for the any other discussions you need from us?
It just kind of dropped in my thoughts, and as it's preparing and going through this, how are we doing on the repayments on the Warrior Stadium and the soccer pitch? Is that still moving regularly?
Sure. So what I can do with that question is I can put that on the agenda for the next meeting. We have kept a spreadsheet current that identifies the amount of what is owed and then the payments in. And we are at about this time of the year anyways, we check in with WAVE to see what their balance is, and part of our process is then to pull that out and back to the district. So I know that when LaDonna retired, she did briefly, I think, show with you where those spreadsheets were at. So if you are okay with it, we can put that on the agenda for the next meeting, and we can bring that back on both projects.
Perfect.
Anything else? Well, at the next meeting at another time. Jack is ready. Okay.
I move to adjourn.
And I second that.